This is Democracy Watch. Mark, we just got a bombshell court ruling. It does not get better than this. Can you explain what just happened in court?
Yeah, Republicans went to Lynchburg, Virginia, home of Liberty University, presumably to judge shop and figure maybe they'd be able to block the new ballot measure that's going forward in Virginia that will create a new map if it's approved by the voters. And Democrats stand to gain 4 seats. Well, Republicans lost. You know, they thought we got the right place, but they lost. That Lynchburg judge shut them down and said that the referendum process will go forward. And Brian, as someone who lives in the Commonwealth of Virginia, I'm going to be among the first online to early vote on Friday of this week.
So you'd mentioned that they went all the way to Lynchburg, Virginia, home of Liberty University. I'm sure people can glean a little bit of what the partisan affiliation is out there. What does it mean that Republicans lost even in a place where they clearly cherry-picked a judge who they thought would be more receptive to their argument?
Look, this is what Republicans do, right? Like, remember the first cases in Virginia were filed in Tazewell County, which for those even in Virginia, they probably don't know where Tazewell County is. It is a very small rural county, essentially in the southwestern part of the state, very Republican county, and they went there, and now they've gone to this county. There's another lawsuit by another individual in Washington County, which is also a rural red county. Look, Republicans are going to pull out all the stops, but Brian, we saw this in California. So Democrats need to just sort of brace themselves for an onslaught of litigation like we saw in California, where, you know, Republicans there went so far as to file lawsuits in Texas to try to stop California from going forward. I mean, you want to talk about judge shopping, right? You're judge shopping when you are trying to block a map in the state of California, and you have gone to Texas and hope that Judge Kaczmarek, who is, you know, a famous conservative federal court judge in Texas, hope that he'll block the case, and he didn't even go for it.
Yeah, well, those are those states' rights that Republicans always beat their chest about. So, Mark, in terms of the ability for Republicans to actually stop this thing now, is that all but gone? Is there a way that they can appeal this even further? I mean, you had mentioned that voting starts on Friday, so I'm assuming that unless we get some temporary restraining order over the next, 72 hours, that this thing is going forward.
Look, there are a number of cases still going on here. There's a case in Richmond brought by Republican congressmen. There are 2 cases that we've talked about before in Tazewell County. You know, at least one of them and probably both of them, we're waiting to hear further from the state Supreme Court on probably early next week. There is this new case that I mentioned filed by an individual voter in Washington County, another rural red county. And I don't think we've seen the last of this, Brian. Brian, we're going to see Republicans in a year in which their electoral fortunes are in decline, right? It's not just these Virginia ballot measures, not just the California ballot measure. It's not just the main ballot measure that happened the same day as California where Republicans lost, but it's also we're seeing it in these special elections, right? Republicans are in real trouble with the voters. The voters of the United States are really unhappy with Donald Trump. His popularity is soured. They're really unhappy with Republicans in Congress. And so Democrats have their wind at their backs. And so the only thing Republicans can do is to file these Hail Mary lawsuits and try to judge shop and cherry pick and hope that they strike gold. But here's the thing, it's all going to fail. It's going to be a messy process. It's going to be a lot of twists and turns. But in the end, this ballot measure is going to go forward. This referendum is going to go forward in Virginia in the same way it did in California. And Republicans are going to spend a ton of money to try to defeat it, just like they did in California. And Brian, what was the result in California? It wasn't even close.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about the other places in which the Republicans' broader effort to engineer themselves a permanent majority in the House backfired in the courts, most of which is happening at the hands of your law firm. But before you answer that question, I just want to note for people that Mark is fighting these battles on the front lines where it matters most. And so a small step that everybody watching can take to support him and his team is to sign up for Democracy Docket. That's the news outlet Mark founded to focus on everything voting in elections. It's a resource that I use on a daily basis. So again, if you want to elevate his voice, which could not be more important than it is right now, and also support his work in the courts where he's fighting for fair maps across the country, best way to do that, easiest way to do that is to subscribe to Democracy Docket. I'm going to put that link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. So Mark, talk about the other ongoing litigation that's going to impact 2026.
Look, I think we got to start with Utah. Now, that's probably not really ongoing anymore, but it's a
Yeah.
good example of where Republicans again overplayed their hands. Republicans could have drawn a Utah map that included a Salt Lake City based district and had a real shot of winning, right? They could have they're going to win every other seat in the state of Utah. And had they drawn a district that kept Salt Lake City basically whole, they would have had a real shot. Instead, because they are so unpopular, because Donald Trump is such a drag, they carved up Salt Lake City into like 4 different pieces. And that offended even the state courts of Utah. We're not going to go for that, right? Because like they don't want their big city carved up into all of these pieces. So they sued and they lost, and then they sued again and they lost, and then they went to federal court and sued and they lost. And so like Utah, in some respects, even though it's only 1 seat and it's, a very red state, I think it is illustrative of what we are seeing throughout the country. Obviously, there is ongoing litigation in the U.S. Supreme Court involving the Calais case. And this is the big case that we all keep waiting to see whether we're going to get a decision. We haven't gotten it yet. There are some people who think, well, maybe it'll come this week in the Supreme Court or next week. At this point, I have to imagine that the justices have just made a decision that they're going to wait until June or late June to decide Calais, because they don't want it to be a factor in the 2026 election. And I suspect that that is probably a coalition of not just the liberal justices, but even people who are hostile to the Voting Rights Act, like the Chief Justice, who has been very hostile to the Voting Rights Act, doesn't see the benefit to the court in throwing itself into the middle of changing this monumental law in a way that will look like they are helping the Republicans. So I think that as we head towards the 2026 midterm elections, redistricting will wind up being a draw. Republicans won't have gained an advantage. I don't think, when we see the primary results in Texas, we'll get a little bit of sense of what turnout is there. And it may turn out that even that gerrymander that they thought would gain them 5 seats, Brian, is not going to gain them 5 seats. So look, the fights are not over. We're still waiting to see what Republicans in Florida do. But would I rather be us or them right now? I'd rather be us.
In terms of the Calais case that you had just mentioned, are we at the point now, in your estimation, where it feels safe enough that it's not going to be some mass redrawing? Even if it was handed down tomorrow, for example, it feels like it's not some mass redrawing of maps, that this isn't, the big rain cloud hanging over the 2026 midterms in the way that it would have been if this decision was handed down second week of January, for example, when the Supreme Court first started issuing their rulings.
Absolutely. Look, I've always said about Calais, there are 2 big time periods to watch. The first was, as you said, in early January, because had the Supreme Court decided this case in early January, there would have been a lot of pressure on these Republican-controlled legislatures to redraw their maps in time for 20.
There's basically that's early enough that no states have primaries that early. And so you could see, South Carolina and Georgia and Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Florida, all of these states could have just drawn out any black majority districts and still had plenty of time left over as we head toward 26.
Correct. And there also would have been, and this is the other part of it, there would have been a lot of political pressure on them to do that. So even in some of these states where the Republican legislature is like, you know what, we actually don't want to have black voters in these neighboring districts because maybe it makes them a little swingier. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Republicans wouldn't be objecting because of decency, but they would worry that taking a very, very heavily black or minority district and putting dispersing those voters into surrounding districts could create competitive districts. There would have been a lot of political pressure from the White House and others to say, don't worry about that, go do that. Well, now, as Donald Trump's popularity has plummeted, and as they have watched other Republican states like New Hampshire, where it's Republican controlled, and Indiana, where it's Republican controlled, refuse to do so, I just think there's just a lot less political will on the part of Republicans to do it. So you have both the fact that since January, the time frame has changed, right? The logistics of it, as you point out, have become nearly impossible in a lot of states because we're so close to the primaries. But also, I mean, my sense is, but you weigh in here, I think the politics of this has changed. I think if you ask the Republicans in Texas today, would they have drawn the map that they drew if they knew what the politics of the states look like today? I think they'd say no. I don't think they would have taken that five seat gamble. I think maybe they would have redrawn for 2 seats or 3 seats. I don't think they would have gone for 5. And I think that that political shift will also impact Republican willingness to sort of wing it here in the last few days if they get a chance. But again, I don't think they'll get that chance. I don't think the Supreme Court's going to rule in this case till June, when it's really too late everywhere.
And by the way, I think you're exactly right on that point. You know, the Republicans redrew their maps with this idea that the demographic shifts that we saw in 2024 were a permanent realignment of their coalition. And what we're learning now is that those demographic swings to the right were not permanent. They were very much temporary, and they're swinging back in a big way. That's why we're seeing, 12, 14, 16, 20, 30, 35 point swings to the left right now. And so if you drew a district where you said, okay, you know what, we're gonna gerrymander these districts and give ourselves, a 10-point buffer, and Democrats are averaging like 16-point swings to the left, that district is in peril now. If you drew a district that's composed mostly of Latino voters, and you saw, based on this latest midterm off-year election cycle, that certain jurisdictions have Latino voters swinging 50 points to the left, what happens to those districts that you've drawn, thinking that those numbers in 2024 are a permanent part of your coalition? And so, yeah, to your exact point, I think that these Republicans absolutely made a mistake and got too cocky, allowed their hubris to take over in terms of redrawing their maps, not recognizing A, how Trump's popularity would weigh them down, and B, the kind of swings that we're seeing as the Republican Party more broadly has failed to really live up to its own campaign promises, and people revolting from exactly that.
Yeah, and I think that what this means going forward is that Donald Trump's got to go to plan B, C, and D, right? I mean, like, the redistricting thing hasn't panned out and in fact may have backfired. So now what you're seeing is, as he is launching a war in Iran, he is also posting on social media that Iran interfered in the 2020 and 2024 election. As redistricting seems to not be an option, you see the Department of Justice not just seeking the voter files from 25 states, they've now increased that to 30 states, including 4 Republican-controlled states. So you're seeing the escalation of the second and third order tactics that the White House and the Republican Party have to rely on because redistricting didn't pan out. And that's the reason why, everyone, you got to subscribe to Brian's channel, because this is a very much a fluid situation, right? Like, one week you are hearing that the big threats to democracy is this, and then you find out that it builds to something even worse. And the best place to stay informed is on this channel. So do me a favor right now and hit the subscribe button. And if you've already done that, hit the bell, because what that does is that means you'll get alerted when there is new content. So when Brian and I have breaking news like we do about this Virginia, you'll get it, and it won't get lost in the clutter of algorithms and all of other shit that is being thrown at you by YouTube.
Well, I'm going to put that link right here on the screen, and I'm also, again, going to put Democracy Docket right here on the screen. You got to support Mark's work, both in the courts and in the media space. There is no person whose voice is more deserving of being elevated than his and his team. So, again, both of those links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.